I was having a theological discussion on Facebook a few months back, and the person I was talking to was confused by my stance on a few things. Over the course of a few messages, I was able to explain that I'm an Augustinian Neoplatonist, Protestant, and an evidentialist. They were sufficiently advanced in their studies to have more questions. Where do I come down on believers' baptism versus paedobaptism? What do I think of evolution? What's my take on eschatology? Most of the questions were easy to answer with a single response, and led to an interesting back and forth on the subject for a few messages. Then there was a question that I struggled to answer. Am I a classical theologian? I told him, I think I'm about as close as someone can get to being a classical theologian without actually being a classical theologian. I would like to explore that thought a little more today. Classical theology is one of those all-encompassing terms that every other theological system wishes it had the presence of mind to claim the title for. Kind of like the fundamental theorem of algebra, or the standard model of particle physics. Classical theologians that are on the stuffy end will hate this, but I've always thought of it as the combination of Platonist philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, and either Christianity or Judaism. There are classical theology versions of both. If you look back at my self-description, adding Neoplatonist to the list does make it seem like I should be right at home with those that identify strongly with those that draw from Aristotle and Plato. I do tend to get along better with classical theologians than those that have abandoned the model of classical theology. Classical theology is a fairly big tent. I've already mentioned that it's big enough to encompass some Christians and some Jews, but even within the Christian circles, classical theology will envelop many Protestants and Catholics. It isn't a denomination so much as a way to approach thinking about God. As such, it's almost easier to say who isn't covered by classical theology than to say who is. Open theists, annihilationists, and universalists are generally not considered classical theologians, for example. Also, if you've seen a movie with God as a character, 5 will get you 10 that it's incompatible with classical theology. The followers of Plato and Aristotle started looking at the Greek pantheon differently than their peers. They were less convinced that the heavenly bodies like the sun and moon were alive, and thought that some of the gods like Eros and Jupiter were living entities in the same realm as numbers and shapes and human souls. This mixed well with Jewish and Christian concepts of an ethereal, omnipresent, all-powerful God. Indeed, if we compare a few lines describing the greatest deity from Plato's Timaeus to God's self-revelation in Genesis and Exodus, the similarities are striking. God desired that all things should be good and nothing bad, so far as this was attainable. Timaeus, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and fell morning were the 6th day. Genesis 1:31, CKJV. For we say that he was, he is, he will be. But the truth is that is alone is properly attributed to him, and that was and will be only to be spoken of becoming in time, Timaeus. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. Exodus 3:14, CKJV. So it's no surprise that when Christians and Jews saw how useful Platonic and Aristotelian logic were to discovering and uncovering truth in other areas, they quickly adapted their views of God to fit both what we read in the Bible and what we read in Plato and Aristotle. Not always consciously. Platonism and Aristotelianism were definitely the philosophical water that the Western Roman Empire was swimming in. They aren't really the water we're swimming in anymore, though. On the one hand, there is definitely something to the summary that all Western philosophy is simply footnotes to Plato. On the other, neither Plato nor Aristotle would recognize the philosophical world we live in. The water we swim in is more like a grandchild of those ancient systems, the scientific method. We are deeply engrossed in the philosophy of quantum mechanics and general relativity. Fiction writers use caricatures of these thoughts to create plots that revolve around space travel and time travel. We are as convinced that empty space can bend and that point-like particles collide as the ancients were that the sun was carried across the sky in a chariot, and the spirit of lust itself could decide who to attack at any time. And that's where I part ways with classical theology. Classical theology seems to me to still be trying to make those old Aristotelian and Platonic ideas work, even when we have long abandoned them in favor of better models. We can see this in particular in the debate between Protestants and Catholics regarding transubstantiation. Catholics continue to speak in terms of accidents and essence in the sense they meant in the 15th century. To be clear, both terms are still terms in valid use. However, they've been adapted. Now, when a chemist says that two substances are essentially the same, he means that they have the same chemical composition. By that standard, we could settle the transubstantiation debate by putting a bit of consecrated bread and wine in a mass spectrometer. If it's bread, it hasn't changed the substance. If it's flesh, it has. Catholic theologians assure us that they mean something different, though. They can't tell us what they mean in modern terms, only in 15th century terms, but them's the breaks. We have similar problems when we speak about God. When I've discussed omnipotence with atheists, they often think of Q from Star Trek or Dr. Manhattan from The Watchmen. While these are interesting characters, they aren't what the first-century authors of the New Testament had in mind. The first-century authors thought in terms of Julius Caesar and his adopted son Augustus. The prophets often spoke of God as Yehovah Tzivot, or Yahweh of armies. When the ancients thought of an omnipotent ruler, omnipotence was at the end of a sword. When the modern mind thinks of omnipotence, it's discovered in a laboratory. Yet somehow, the classical theologian still feels the need to defend the words omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. I don't. That said, I get along better with classical theologians than open theists. When someone starts a sentence with God can't, or God doesn't know, or God isn't located at, I start to get nervous that I'm going to need to correct someone. Now, it may be that by the end of the sentence I end up agreeing with the person. There have been sentences that start these ways for which I have ended up agreeing. God can't die. God doesn't know what it's like to fear death. And God isn't located in the grave, make a nice, symmetric set of examples of statements I can agree with, given the right nuance. Classical theologians will usually join me there, where the open theists use that as a crack in the door to go much further in limiting God's power. However, unlike classical theists, I'm not interested in maintaining the Aristotelian vocabulary and imagery. The reason we've largely abandoned it in physics, chemistry, and other hard sciences is because it turned out that it didn't actually capture the reality of the physical world, and the natural philosophers were looking right at the physical world when they came up with the terminology to replace it. I'm highly skeptical of the ability of that same system to accurately capture the unseen realm. Their inability to envision China accurately makes me dubious of their ability to envision God's throne room accurately. And yet, I'm equally unwilling to simply toss it all away. The late Dr. Michael Heiser was famous for saying that he thinks we need to have a tiny Israelite living in our head to help us interpret the Bible. When reading the text, we need to read it according to the science and culture of that day. I partially agree with this, except that I think we also to make new terminology and imagery that gets us closer to the truth. Some people erroneously say that we can't trust the ramblings of Bronze Age goat herders. I say that in divine matters, I would trust an inspired Bronze Age goat herder, or an Iron Age librarians, as more accurately reflects the biblical authors, over an uninspired 21st century scientist. I do find that when I embrace the ancient concept of God uncritically, it's not helpful to me. However, when I try to update that thought to modern categories and apply them, it is often helpful. One example of a way that I do this differently than most classical theists is that I don't fixate on any particular definition of omnipotent. I'm more interested in describing God as he actually is, rather than conforming him to a particular idea that I've come up with. Classical theologians will often start with a definition of omnipotence, such as God can do whatever is logically possible, and then seek to explain why God would choose to allow Michael to be restrained from visiting Daniel, or why Jesus didn't perform miracles in his home country. Because I'm in the minority, and because I don't have a strong defense for my position on these things, I don't talk about them much. When people try to pin me down, I simply note that conversations about omnipotence in the philosophical and theological literature are much more complex than many realize, and that I'm not beholden to terms invented in the Middle Ages. There are definitely wrong ways to do this wrong, though. Some of the ancients saw that when they looked inside themselves, they could imagine incredible worlds. Omniscience seemed the logical outcome of a mind unbound from a body. Some open theists will see that all of the minds we are aware of are contained in some kind of brain, and that the capacity of these brains are limited. So they imagine that God has a hard drive somewhere that can be filled up. Most classical theologians just say this is wrong, and don't go much further. The classical theologian is right at home with the first line of the Tao Te Ching. The way that can be trodden is not the enduring and unchanging way. The name that can be named is not the enduring and unchanging name. They say that the mind of God is not bound by matter, but they can't explain how that works. Certainly, if God had a hard drive somewhere that could be filled up, we would know where it was, and it would be full by now. God's mind is not like our mind in that way. For my part, do not feel the need of the classical theologian to say that God has a mind in the way we are accustomed to thinking of a mind, nor do I feel the need of the open theists to declare that there is an identifiable limit to God's knowledge. I still think that the best explanation of the evidence of answered prayer is that God's experience of time is not sequential like our own. This and the general development of classical thought into more robust, modern explanations, coupled with certain biblical passages, causes me to see God more like a fundamental field. We have space-time for gravity, electromagnetism for light, and God for justice. And that's why God is without passion and reaction. That's just not what God is. The ancients also noted that God was without passion or reaction, though. They had in mind an unemotional, perfectly logical God who nevertheless did love us. In modern terms, we think we detect a paradox. That sounds more like a machine than a person to us. But remember, these ancients also believed that abstract ideas like fairness or lust were actually gods. I think it's fair to conclude that modern intuition about what it means for something to be personal and ancient wisdom on the subject were not fully aligned. Today, when we think about things that are on the edge of personhood, we discuss Vision from Marvel Comics or Johnny Five from the Short Circuit movies. We approach that entire question from the other angle. Instead of asking what we would have to take away from us to stop us from being people, we are asking what we have to add to ChatGTP for it to start being a person. There are other definitions applied to God from the Middle Ages that I don't use of my own accord. For example, supernatural is a word that I won't generally use first, because if I talk to 5 people, there will be at least 6 definitions in play. Often, supernatural is used as a synonym for imaginary. Other times, someone will have a much more interesting meaning in mind. If the person I'm talking to wants to define supernatural for me, I'll use the definition they give. However, often after that give a detailed definition for supernatural or omnipotent or omniscient, and I end up saying, "That's interesting. No, God isn't that." So when you come down to the question, I'm not really a classical theologian. But I'm very much inspired by classical theology, and I respect classical theology, and I accept classical theology as the default baseline from which I draw. I think I'm about as close as someone can get to being a classical theologian without actually being a classical theologian.